A single man in a gray t-shirt stood on the front porch of a tan Colorado house, framed by two white pillars and a closed red door. It was a bright August day, the kind that usually belongs to sprinklers and children's laughter, not to missing person reports and quiet dread. His arms folded and unfolded, then folded again across his chest as he spoke. He described his wife as just gone. He said his little girls were somewhere. He used words that should have trembled, but they did not. His voice was steady, almost casual, as if all of this might still turn out to be a misunderstanding. People who would later watch that footage did so knowing what the officers standing nearby did not yet know. They knew this man had already killed the pregnant wife he claimed to miss. They knew he had already taken the lives of the daughters he called his world. They knew that while he asked the public for help, the bodies of those three lay hidden in a desolate patch of industrial land, far from the manicured lawns and beige siding behind him. The question that would haunt viewers was simple and terrible. How does a father walk past the empty bedrooms of his children, walk out into the light, and talk about them as if they still might come home? To understand that porch, that voice, that unsettling calm, you have to step back from the camera and move through time. You have to leave that August afternoon in 2018 and drift backward into the slow accumulation of days and choices that brought a quiet mechanic from North Carolina and an ambitious young woman from the same state into a shared life in Colorado, where their story would first look like a promise and then end as an unthinkable betrayal. Before there were headlines, there was a friendship request on a social media screen. A young woman, already walking through illness and divorce, lay in bed one day, weak and uncertain about the future. She received a request from someone she barely knew, a man with a plain face and an easy, unthreatening smile. She thought briefly of ignoring it. She had enough on her plate, enough worry and medication and loneliness, but something, a mixture of curiosity and the human need for connection, made her click accept. With that small gesture, a new path opened, one she entered with more hope than caution. He was quiet, at first almost background noise in her chaotic life. Where she was outspoken, he was reserved. Where she talked openly about her struggles, he listened. She would later say that he appeared in her life at a time when she felt no one else would want her, when doctors' visits and diagnoses made her feel like damaged goods. He did not run from that. He drove her to appointments. He sat with her in waiting rooms. He put gas in her car, carried bags, did small, ordinary things that accumulate into something that feels like devotion. For a woman fighting to rebuild her sense of self, these gestures landed with enormous weight. Here was a man who did not flinch at her medical chart, who did not back away from her exhaustion and fear. In him, she saw stability, patience, a kind of solid kindness that contrasted sharply with the turmoil she had known. In her, he saw a woman with energy and drive, someone who pushed past illness to build something purposeful. Their differences braided together into an attachment that, from the outside, looked like a mutual rescue. They married. There were photographs of outdoor ceremonies, smiles broad and unshadowed, the kind of images that get framed on mantles and posted as proof that love can still be found after disappointment. Families gathered, some uneasy about the speed of it all, but willing to be won over by her enthusiasm and his steady presence. When the wedding was over and the dress put away, the reality of fused lives began: bills, routines, negotiations over habits, the daily compromises that define marriage far more than vows spoken under rented lights. They did not settle in North Carolina. They went west to Colorado, chasing opportunity and lower humidity and the idea of a fresh start. The move itself was demanding. Selling one house, buying another, relocating belongings and pets and hopes across states. But it also became part of the couple's shared mythology. They were building something together, something new, something better than what either had known before. She documented it all online, turning their life into a curated sequence of posts and videos that radiated optimism. In those posts, she talked about health products and personal transformation, about gratitude and second chances. She filmed her husband returning from work, called him the best, the most wonderful, the perfect match she had never expected to find. He smiled into the camera, sometimes shyly, sometimes with an awkward stiffness that suggested he was more comfortable under the hood of a truck than with a lens pointed at his face. Still, he participated. He put the girls on his shoulders, kissed his wife's forehead, played the role of the supportive husband in scenes that were both sincere and performative. Children arrived, one, then another. 2 little girls with similar faces, sharing their mother's expressive eyes and their father's rounded cheeks. They filled the house with noise. Toys spread across floors. Tiny shoes collected near the door. Birthday parties were filmed and shared. The young mother, who had once feared that illness had robbed her of the chance to have children, now had 2, and she framed them as miracles, as blessings, as evidence that perseverance and faith could push back against the limits doctors had described. For him, fatherhood came with both genuine affection and heavy pressure. He worked in the oil industry, a job that demanded early mornings, long drives, physical risk, and the steady presence of danger that clung to every site where flammable substances lay under the earth. He left the house in darkness, often before his daughters woke, and returned to the endless cycle of bills, repairs, and responsibilities that defined so many middle-class American lives. He was not a man of big speeches. He showed care in quieter ways, feeding the dog, loading the dishwasher, sitting on the floor with the girls and their plastic toys after long shifts. Above this ordinary grind hovered a series of financial numbers that never quite cooperated. There was consumer debt, medical debt, a bankruptcy in their recent history, late notices on the mortgage. The social media videos showed vacations, gifts, product packages, and dinners out. The bank statements showed something else. Stress seeped in sideways, through phone calls from creditors, through arguments about spending, through the dull ache of knowing that they were living on the edge of what their income could sustain. She pushed harder in her work, a multi-level marketing system that demanded constant self-promotion, constant smiling through fatigue, constant insistence that success was both present and imminent. To sell the dream, she had to live it online. So she did. Every compliment to her husband, every post about their perfect partnership, every caption about being blessed served 2 purposes. It expressed genuine love, and it reinforced the image that would help her business survive. He, less invested in that performative world, withdrew into himself. He lost weight, joined friends at the gym, reshaped his body into something leaner, more defined. On the surface, it looked like a healthy transformation, the result of his wife's health products and encouragement. Underneath, a more complicated shift occurred. As he felt better physically, he also felt a kind of restless dissatisfaction. The life he had built began to feel confining rather than comforting. The responsibilities that once felt like a privilege now felt like chains. It was in that vulnerable, discontented space that another woman entered his orbit. She was a coworker, part of the same industrial ecosystem that gave him employment and stole his mornings. She did not know him as the man from the videos, the endlessly praised husband in his wife's curated content. She knew him as the quiet guy at work who suddenly seemed more talkative, more attentive. In conversations over spreadsheets and field reports, he found a different version of himself taking shape, one not defined by being somebody's husband, somebody's father, somebody's amazing support system, but simply a man with preferences, opinions, desires. The relationship that began as casual interaction became, over time, an affair. Its early days were laced with secrecy and excitement, the intoxicating sense of being seen in a new light. In that mirror, he liked what he saw. Here was someone who looked at him without the context of years of debt, illness, and argument. She saw a man who was getting into shape, who talked about wanting more from life, who described feeling unappreciated at home. With every confession, carefully framed to flatter himself and cast his wife as demanding, he laid another brick in a wall between his present life and the new one he imagined. At home, his wife sensed the change like a temperature shift. There were fewer affectionate touches, fewer shared jokes. He spent more time looking at his phone, more time scrolling, typing, deleting. Her attempts at conversation were met with vague answers or silence. She asked him what was wrong. He said nothing. She pressed. He deflected. For a woman whose livelihood depended on reading people, persuading them, winning their trust, this distance from her own husband was both confusing and deeply painful. Her messages to friends during that period painted a portrait of someone trying to rationalize the unraveling. Maybe it was stress. Maybe it was his uncomfortable relationship with her family. Maybe it was the weight loss and new routines. She swung between anger at his coldness and compassion for his challenges. She talked about feeling alone in the marriage, about trying to hold everything together, about fearing that he did not love her the way he once had. Still, she believed the foundation could be repaired. She believed time and effort would bring him back. He, by contrast, allowed his inner life to tilt increasingly toward the fantasy of total escape. The idea of divorce appeared, then grew. It was safer to contemplate than murder, and in countless other households it would have been the worst outcome. But in his mind, separation carried complications, financial division, child support, a smaller life, the need to face extended family's judgment. More importantly, it meant sharing the children, seeing them regularly, being accountable to them. The version of himself that now dominated his thinking wanted absolute freedom from all of it. No split, no negotiation, just a clean, brutal erasure of obligations. When she discovered she was pregnant again, she reacted with a mixture of shock and joy. A third child, a boy, felt to her like an unexpected gift, a chance to complete the family she had fought so hard to build. She crafted a reveal for him, filmed the moment, watched his face. She saw what she wanted to see, surprise, then happiness. Later, in private moments, his true reaction slipped out in fragments. He did not want another child. He felt overwhelmed, trapped, smothered under a weight of responsibility he had never fully embraced. In those final months, their lives diverged into parallel tracks. Outwardly, the family still appeared intact. There were vacations, including a long trip to visit her family without him, during which she texted him about missing his support, about wanting to fix what was broken. Inwardly, he spent his time at home exploring what a life with the other woman could look like. They took trips of their own. They searched for apartments. They talked about a future timeline in which he would be free. The last week of her life, she went to Arizona for a work event. She left their daughters with him and flew out, carrying both anxiety and determination. She told friends she needed this time to reset, to clear her head, to think about the marriage from a distance. She also needed it for her business, for the constant performance that brought in each additional commission check. From hotel rooms and conference halls, she sent him messages of concern, sometimes pleading, sometimes confrontational. He responded with coolness, with clipped answers that gave her nothing solid to hold on to. While she was away, he deepened his connection with his mistress. They went to a restaurant, walked along the shore of a lake, presented themselves to the world as an ordinary couple at the beginning of something hopeful. In his mind, the two paths he was walking could not stay separate much longer. He could not forever be both a devoted family man and a passionate new partner. The conflict sharpened, and with it, the dark fantasy that had been hovering at the edges of his thinking grew more concrete. By the time she flew back toward Colorado in the small hours of August 13, 2018, the decision had already been made. Not by her, who still believed, despite the pain, that there might be a way forward. By him, who had decided that the existence of his wife and children was incompatible with the version of himself he wished to inhabit. On that flight, she slept in short, stiff intervals, unaware that she was heading not toward reconciliation or renewed conflict, but toward a plan as calculated as it was cowardly. A friend dropped her off at the house in Frederick close to 2 a.m. The security camera at the front door, installed to provide an additional layer of safety for a woman often alone with children, captured her final moments alive outside the home. A silhouette under weak light, hauling a small suitcase, adjusting her bag, unlocking the door. Shadows swallowed her as she stepped inside. The door closed. The friend drove away. The neighborhood fell back into the ordinary stillness of the pre-dawn hours. Inside, there was no camera, no recording. Everything that follows has been reconstructed from his shifting accounts, forensic evidence, and the absence left behind. He said they argued. That much is almost certain. The topic was, as it had been for months, the state of their marriage. She wanted answers about his emotional distance, about his unwillingness to touch her, about the fact that he seemed present only in the logistical sense, not in heart or mind. She wanted to talk about their unborn son, about what naming him meant, about whether her husband was prepared to step back into the role he had once embraced. She confronted him with what she knew or suspected about his affair. He did not deny everything. By then, the affair had already pushed its way into their reality too far to be completely hidden. But instead of treating that confrontation as a painful turning point leading perhaps to separation, he treated it as an obstacle to be removed. At some point in those dark hours, words ended and physical violence began. He attacked her, taking advantage of her vulnerability, of her fatigue, of the fact that she still trusted that the man in front of her would not cross the final line into lethal harm. The act of killing someone is simple in description and devastating in reality. Flesh, bone, lungs, heart, all designed to keep a body alive, suddenly deprived of what they need. The man who had once stayed with her through hospital stays now used his strength to extinguish her life. The woman who had praised him to thousands of viewers online as her rock, her partner, her best friend, died in the same house where she had filmed those compliments. There was no dramatic soundtrack, no echoing scream, just a silence that gradually settled into every room. There are details, often repeated in coverage, about what he did next to his daughters. Details that press against the limits of what many can bear to imagine. Small beds, small blankets, small voices asking questions. A father who chooses in sequence to erase each of them. The manner in which he killed them, the things he later claimed they said, the order in which he acted, all reveal a man not caught in a flash of uncontrollable rage, but moving through a series of deliberate, monstrous decisions. When it was over, when all three were dead, he was left with a house that looked almost normal and 3 bodies that bore witness to an unforgivable crime. It is here that calculation took full control. He needed to work the next day. He needed to act as if life continued. He needed to get rid of them. His solution was to turn to the place where he knew he could be alone with time and heavy equipment, an oil and gas site owned by his employer, out on the flat, scrub-covered land beyond the subdivisions. The security camera that had captured his wife's last arrival now captured him making trips from the house to his work truck before dawn. Up and down the driveway, in and out of the garage, the shadowed bulk of his body moving with purpose. Neighbors, asleep behind their curtains, did not watch. The camera did. Later, investigators would stand in front of a television screen and watch those grainy movements with a grim understanding of what each step represented. He loaded his wife's body onto the floor of the truck's rear compartment. He placed his daughters in the back seat, alive according to his own later statement, although some investigators and observers believe the timeline suggests otherwise. The truck, marked with company logos, pulled away from the house as the sun began to lift the darkness. In the back, either the remains or the last hours of his family traveled with him along empty roads toward a place they had never seen, a patch of land where he believed their existence could be erased. The oil site was remote. Storage tanks rose like ghostly cylinders against the paling sky. Gravel crunched under tires. There were no neighbors here, no doorbell cameras, no curious eyes. He parked, got out, and began the work of disposal. His wife he carried to a shallow depression in the earth, scraping out enough space with his hands and tools to lower her in and cover her with dirt. His daughters he placed, one at a time, into separate oil tanks, lifting the heavy hatches, pushing their small bodies through 8-inch openings they should never have been near. Back at the house, their bedrooms remained frozen in ordinary disarray. Small pajamas on the floor, toys and stuffed animals arranged in the random order of play, a closet with little dresses. It would be hours before anyone outside his own mind knew that these rooms were now monuments to absence rather than spaces for living children. He returned from the site, showered, washed his work clothes, and began to build the new fiction his survival depended on. He texted his wife's phone, messages he knew would go unanswered. He called her favorite hospital, asking if they had seen a pregnant woman matching her description. He told coworkers he was worried, told friends she might have left with the kids. To his mistress, he presented himself as a man dealing with a sudden, confusing disappearance, simultaneously feeding her narrative of him as a wronged husband and preparing himself to step fully into the life they had discussed. But he had underestimated the people in his wife's life. She had a friend, the one who had dropped her off in the early morning, who expected to hear from her after a prenatal appointment later that day. When the appointment was missed and messages went unanswered, worry settled quickly into something sharper. This friend knew her routines. She knew how carefully her pregnant friend tracked her health, how unlikely she was to miss such a critical checkup without explanation. She drove to the house. The car was in the driveway. The shoes were by the door. The phone went to voicemail. She called the husband. His responses were vague, unnervingly calm. He said his wife had told him she was going to a friend's house with the kids. The friend at the door did not believe that. The silence inside the house, the fact that she could see the purse through a window, the absence of any sign of departure, all screamed that something was badly wrong. She called the police. What began as a welfare check quickly turned into something else. Officers, body cameras recording, arrived at the quiet cul-de-sac. They knocked, called out, walked the perimeter. The husband reached again, said he was at work but would return. While they waited, the friend pushed for entry. She knew the garage code, but it did not work. An officer made some calls, checked windows, debated how far they could go without the homeowner present. All of this is preserved from the viewpoint of chest-mounted cameras, the relaxed but slightly puzzled officer, the increasingly anxious friend, the stillness of the house. When he finally pulled up, his truck rolling into the frame, his demeanor was not that of a man fearing some unknown tragedy inside his home. He shook hands, made small talk, unlocked the door. As the group moved inside, the cameras followed. They captured his wife's purse sitting on a counter, her medications, her keys, her phone. They recorded his reaction, a kind of surface concern without the frantic, disorganized panic that often comes when people realize someone they love has vanished unexpectedly. In the bedroom, the bed where his wife had died was stripped. The fitted sheet was missing. The top sheet and comforter were loosely arranged, an attempt at staging that failed under close scrutiny. In the children's rooms, their small beds were empty, but nothing suggested that they had been packed for a trip. The officer noted these details, along with the oddly calm husband who seemed more worried about his television not working than about his missing family. Observations turned into quiet suspicion. The missing persons report went out. Local news crews arrived. The same day, he agreed to speak on camera to ask for the public's help. He stood under the glare of the sun and described his home as empty without his girls, his words separated from his earlier actions by only a few hours. Viewers did not yet know they were watching the killer. They simply saw a man whose effect did not match their expectations of fear and grief. Those first instincts, the sense that something was off, would later be validated in the most devastating way. Behind the scenes, detectives moved with increasing urgency. They interviewed the friend, whose certainty that something terrible had happened did not waver. They spoke with neighbors, one of whom mentioned having a security camera pointed toward the Watts driveway. Reviewing that footage, they saw the early morning activity, the truck backed into the garage, the repeated trips, the prolonged presence before departure. It contradicted his claim that he had simply left for work as usual, unaware of anything amiss. They pulled his phone records, his text messages, his call logs. Patterns emerged, conversations with the other woman, searches for vacation spots. Declarations about being at the happiest point in his life during the very period when he described his marriage as failing. They saw a man investing emotionally in a future without his current family while still living in the same house with them. The gap between his words and his actions widened. When they brought him in for a formal interview, they treated him with outward respect but inward skepticism. He sat in a small room under fluorescent lights, hands folded, posture slightly defensive. They asked about his marriage. He described separation and talking about splitting up, words that undercut the image of a sudden disappearance. They asked about how he left the house that morning. He repeated the story about his wife taking the children to a friend's house. Again and again, his answers floated just above the surface of what could be checked. The detectives, skilled at observing micro-expressions and shifts in tone, began to apply pressure. They asked him to take a polygraph test, explaining that it would help clear him if he was innocent. He agreed, either overestimating his ability to maintain control or underestimating the effectiveness of someone trained to read physiological responses. On the day of the test, he sat connected to wires and sensors, answering questions as the machine recorded the subtle tremors of his body. The examiner, after the test, delivered a blunt assessment he had failed. In the interview room, confronted with this, he seemed to shrink slightly, the relaxed front he had maintained beginning to crack. He asked to see his father, who had flown in from out of state, bewildered by what he had stepped into. Sitting together, father and son, he offered a partial confession, one that shifted blame onto the woman he had already murdered. He claimed to have killed her only after seeing her harm their daughters. It was a story designed to evoke sympathy, to recast him as a man provoked into violence by an unimaginable act. But the detectives, listening from another room, understood its true function, a last attempt to control the narrative. When they came back in, they dismantled it piece by piece. The physical evidence did not support his claim. The condition of the bodies, once recovered, would further expose the lie. His timeline, his digital footprint, his previous statements, all converged to make clear what he was so desperate to hide. The pressure became intolerable. At some point, he crossed the line from denial into confession, not out of remorse strong enough to override his self-interest, but out of the realization that the only path left ran through admitting to what he had done. Even then, he tried to hold back details, to keep some part of the horror shrouded. Yet the core truth emerged. There had been no intruder, no kidnapping, no sudden burst of retaliatory violence from his wife. There had only been his choice, carried out in the quiet of a sleeping house. As news of the confession broke, the community that had searched, prayed, and hoped felt a collective wave of shock and revulsion. The missing mother and daughters had not vanished into some stranger's vehicle. They had been with him all along. The face on the porch, the man pleading into cameras, was revealed not as a grieving victim, but as a perpetrator so devoid of conscience that he could stand only feet from the scene of his crimes and calmly ask for help in covering them up. At the desolate oil site, investigators and recovery teams moved with grim precision. They exhumed the shallow grave, lifting the body of the pregnant woman from the earth with as much care as circumstances allowed. They worked to remove the girls from the narrow tanks, a process made complicated by the environment and by the industrial nature of the structures. Each step was documented, each indignity inflicted in death recorded so that in court, no one could claim the full picture had not been seen. In Weld County, prosecutors began their work. They assembled timelines, gathered expert testimony, collected every piece of digital and physical evidence that would help them show a jury not only what had happened, but how long it had been in the making. They spoke with family members, friends, co-workers, anyone who could shed light on the dynamics within the Watts household and on the character of the man now accused of multiple counts of first-degree murder. His mistress, thrust into an unwanted spotlight, spoke with investigators about their relationship. She described a man who had presented himself as already separated, on the verge of divorce, the victim of a controlling and unsupportive wife. She talked about his assurances that the marriage was over, about his plans to find an apartment together, about his insistence that he and his wife no longer shared a bed. In her story, he appeared not as a killer, but as a liar of a different kind, one who had invented a story about his home life to free himself morally to pursue her. In the midst of this gathering storm, he faced a choice: go to trial and force the families to sit through days or weeks of testimony about the final moments of their loved ones, or plead guilty and accept that he would never again walk free. For someone who had so consistently chosen the path of least immediate discomfort, the decision might have seemed clear. Yet there were still conversations, still negotiations, still an undercurrent of self-interest. He wanted to avoid the death penalty. Prosecutors, aware of the emotional toll a capital case would take, weighed the broader interests of justice and the wishes of the victims' families. Ultimately, he entered guilty pleas to all charges: the murder of his wife, the murder of his 2 daughters, the unlawful termination of his unborn son, and related counts. In a courtroom made thick by the presence of grief, the judge went through each count, asking for confirmation. His answers were short, stripped of the emotional language that had populated his earlier media appearances. Guilty. Yes, sir. Words that formally etched his responsibility into the record. The sentencing hearing became one of the few spaces where the voices of the victims' surviving loved ones could be heard. Her family spoke not in legal terms, but in the language of loss and outrage. They described a daughter who had pulled herself up after setbacks, who had given everything she had to her children, who had believed in her husband long after he had ceased to deserve that belief. They described granddaughters with specific quirks and preferences, not just names and dates. They addressed him directly, telling him that his decision had not only killed their flesh and blood, but had also torn apart the web of trust that holds families together. His own family sat nearby, devastated in a different way. They had raised a son, a brother, who had grown into a man capable of these acts. They had known his faults, his passivity, his discomfort with conflict, but they had not seen him as violent. Now they watched him stand before a judge while chains clinked softly at his ankles, knowing that their name would forever be linked with an atrocity. Complex emotions twisted through them: love for the family they had lost through violence, love for the son who had committed that violence, horror at what he had done, disbelief that the boy they remembered could become the man at the defense table. The judge, before pronouncing sentence, spoke in measured tones about the enormity of the crime. He noted the planned nature of the acts, the vulnerability of the victims, the utter absence of justification. He called it, in essence, one of the most heinous crimes he had seen. Then he imposed multiple life sentences without the possibility of parole, stacked to ensure that even in theory, There would be no future hearing where the man who had destroyed his family could argue for release. Prison swallowed him. The quiet suburban house in Frederick, with its tan siding and two-car garage, became a tourist site of sorts for a time, a macabre stop for those drawn to the physical locations of notorious crimes. Eventually, new owners would move in, paint walls, bring in new furniture, try to overwrite the echoes. But in the minds of those who had followed the story, that house would always remain connected to the grainy doorbell footage of a pregnant woman returning home one last time, and to the porch where her killer calmly spoke about missing her. Inside prison walls, he transitioned from intake to permanent housing, another number in a system designed to contain human beings whose actions the rest of society refuses to tolerate outside razor wire. He was separated from general population at times for his own safety. Child killers often occupy the lowest rung in the brutal currency of inmate hierarchies. Letters began to arrive from strangers, some condemning, some disturbingly admiring. There is a sickness that clings to certain high-profile murderers, a fascination that leads some to write, to profess love, to propose marriage, as if proximity to infamy confers meaning on an otherwise ordinary life. He responded to some of them, selecting those whose attention fed his need to remain central in a narrative, even as he spent his days in a small cell far from the suburban trappings he had once considered oppressive. With each letter, each interview request, each mention in a documentary, he was reminded that he had achieved a kind of endless visibility, though not the kind any sane person should envy. His name became shorthand for a particular kind of domestic horror, invoked whenever a seemingly devoted family man behaved in ways that did not quite fit. For the families of the victims, there was no such complicated notoriety, only the daily work of living with absences that did not diminish. Birthdays came and went, the dates now markers not of celebration, but of what could have been. The due date of the unborn son passed, an invisible line in time across which he should have entered the world. Holidays became landmines of memory. Photographs were no longer updated but rearranged, revisited, clutched in private moments when the weight of loss pressed hardest. In the years since, countless people have watched the videos of the little girls singing, of their mother laughing on live streams, of the husband coming home with flowers or presents. They have paused, rewound, squinted, searching for some visible crack. Was there a glance that lasted too long, a stiffness in his smile that hinted at contempt rather than love, a moment when his eyes seemed empty? The impulse behind this forensic viewing is understandable. If there are signs, perhaps next time someone will see them in time. Yet the deeper truth may be more unsettling. Sometimes the face of a future killer looks entirely ordinary. Sometimes the movements of his hands as he carries a toddler, or slices a birthday cake, or kisses his wife on camera, are indistinguishable from those of a man who would never harm his family. The difference is not in the curve of the jaw or the slant of the brow. It is in the invisible, shifting architecture of his inner life, a place no lens can penetrate until the day he chooses to let his thoughts become actions. Long after the legal documents are archived and the media cycle moves on, the story of this particular man and the family he annihilated lingers, because it strikes so close to the fragile assumptions that allow people to sleep at night. We like to believe that evil announces itself, that it comes with warning labels, with obvious malice, with a history of violence that makes its final eruption less surprising. In the case of Chris Watts, there was no such comfortable pattern for outsiders to point to. There was only a slow erosion of empathy and a growing willingness to see the people he should have loved as obstacles rather than as human beings. The tapes of the investigation, the interviews, the courtroom proceedings, all form a kind of mosaic. Viewed piece by piece, they show a quiet man, a talkative woman, two small girls, smiling friends, concerned officers, a methodical prosecutor, grieving families. Viewed together, they reveal something much darker: how easy it was for one man to exploit the trust others placed in him, how thoroughly he used that trust as cover while he planned, executed, and then tried to conceal the destruction of his own household. And somewhere, far from the cameras and the courtrooms, in the flat, open land of a Colorado oil field, the ground and steel tanks that once held the bodies of a mother and her children stand as mute witnesses to the worst decision he ever made. A decision that cannot be undone, justified, or fully understood, only remembered as a warning that sometimes the most terrifying danger comes not from outside the home, but from the person who shares your bed, your table, your dreams. It is tempting, staring at the outline of this tragedy, to believe that it belongs to a separate category of human behavior, something so alien that it has nothing to do with ordinary life. Yet the more closely one examines the months and years that led up to the murders, the more discomforting the conclusion becomes. Many of the ingredients that preceded the violence are not rare. Financial pressure, marital strain, emotional distance, a secret affair, the desire to reinvent oneself. These are common features of countless homes that will never become crime scenes. What is uncommon is the way those pressures settled in his mind and hardened into a single, monstrous solution. There is a particular kind of criminal, sometimes referred to as a family annihilator, a person who destroys the very family structure that defines him. Often they are middle-aged men, outwardly stable, inwardly collapsing under a mix of ego, entitlement, and fear of public failure. They may be respected in their communities, active in their children's lives, perceived as attentive spouses. When their actions finally erupt into violence, neighbors call reporters and say the same hollow phrase again and again. They never would have expected this from him. Chris Watts fit this pattern in unnerving ways. He was not loud, not flamboyant, not even particularly charismatic. He moved through life in the background, letting his more extroverted wife take center stage. He did not demand public attention. He was content to appear in the margins of her videos, to offer a shy wave, to hold a birthday cake while she narrated. That quiet, combined with the apparent devotion of his early years of marriage, encouraged people to see him as solid and safe. It also meant that his inner world went largely unexamined. When his dissatisfaction grew, he did not voice it in counseling sessions or long, painful conversations with friends. He rarely erupted in obvious anger. Instead, he internalized grievances, nurtured resentment in silence, and turned to secret channels for expression. Late at night, messages to his mistress described a man who felt controlled, misunderstood, and suffocated. In those communications, he cast himself as a victim, someone desperately trying to find happiness in a situation that did not allow it. This pattern of self-pity became a lens through which he viewed every aspect of his life. His wife's demands for honesty felt like a tax. Her expectations that he be present for the children felt like unfair burdens. The house they had bought together felt heavy around his shoulders. The unborn son, instead of representing new life, became in his mind another weight tied to his ankles. The more he leaned into the fantasy of escape, the less he saw the human reality of the people around him. After his conviction, some professionals and observers tried to map his personality onto existing frameworks. Traits associated with narcissism appeared: a tendency to see himself at the center of every story, a lack of genuine empathy, a willingness to manipulate others for personal gain. There were also signs of what some call covert or vulnerable narcissism, characterized not by boasting and dominance, but by quiet grandiosity and deep-seated resentment when the world does not reflect the self-image one believes it should. He did not pound his chest. He moved through rooms as if slightly wounded, believing he deserved more appreciation than he received. None of these labels, however, fully explain the leap from discontent to murder. Many people with similar traits never harm anyone physically. The crucial gap between thought and action, between fleeting fantasies of escape and the concrete decision to kill, remains a space that no diagnostic manual can entirely illuminate. In that darkness, one must accept a hard truth. There was a moment, perhaps a series of moments, when he understood that what he was planning would end the lives of his wife and children, and he chose to proceed anyway. In his rare, controlled conversations from prison, he has occasionally described the murders as if the decisions emerged from nowhere, as if he were suddenly standing in a situation he did not fully understand. He talks about feeling out of his body, about the surreal quality of those early morning hours. This language may be genuine in his mind, a way of grappling with the enormity of what he did. It is also, undeniably, a way of distancing himself from the deliberate nature of his actions. People who choose to commit atrocities often seek comfort in narratives that distribute responsibility into the air rather than leaving it fully on their own shoulders. The physical evidence contradicts the idea of a sudden, incomprehensible snap. He planned enough to choose an isolated site connected to his job, to back his truck into the garage to avoid being seen loading bodies, to text his wife's phone in a performance of ignorance, to call schools and hospitals in a performance of concern. Planning and panic can coexist, but the presence of method reveals a mind capable of organizing steps toward a horrific goal. That is the most chilling aspect, the banality of planning wrapped around an act that annihilates 3 lives. For her, the last months of life were filled with attempts to repair what she believed could be repaired. Her messages to friends show a woman who knew something was wrong and refused to ignore it. She confronted him about his distance. She pushed for counseling. She tried to understand his feelings without surrendering her own needs. She imagined, as many do in troubled marriages, that if both parties faced the issues honestly, they might still salvage what they had. She did not know that the person across from her had already given up on repair and moved toward erasure. Her advocacy for herself and her children did not make her difficult, as he sometimes framed it. It made her responsible. She was willing to be unpopular in the short term if it meant securing long-term stability for her family. She had overcome illness, financial hardship, and criticism before. She assumed that this conflict too could be managed with enough communication and effort. In a cruel inversion, the strength that had allowed her to keep the family afloat through previous storms became, in his resentful eyes, another sign that she stood between him and the life he now believed he deserved. The 2 little girls at the center of this case have become, in the public memory, symbols of innocence betrayed. In videos, they appear completely at ease with their father. They climb on him, lean against him, mirror his expressions. They trusted him entirely, not because they were naive, but because children are supposed to be able to trust their parents completely. That trust is the foundation on which all society rests, the assumption that the adult who carries you to bed would never carry you to your death. It is that fundamental betrayal that continues to make the Watts case so difficult to digest. Crimes between strangers, while horrifying, can be placed in a category of external danger. Crimes within families, especially those involving children, tear at our sense of the natural order. A parent is meant to stand between their child and harm, even at the cost of their own safety. When a parent becomes the source of harm, the emotional impact radiates outward far beyond the immediate circle of relatives. In the years since the murders, true crime audiences have revisited the details countless times, each retelling emphasizing different aspects. Some focus on the forensic work, the digital footprints, the body camera footage, the careful reconstruction of timelines. Others focus on the psychological dynamics, searching his gestures and words for clues to his inner emptiness. Still others center the narrative on her, reclaiming the story from his actions by highlighting her resilience, her love for her children, and the way she refused to give up on a marriage long after he had checked out. There is a delicate line between understanding and obsession. To understand cases like this is to hope, perhaps naively, that greater awareness might one day prevent similar tragedies. To become obsessed is to risk turning real pain into a kind of entertainment. The Watts case sits precariously on that line. Documentaries fill streaming queues, podcasts dissect each new detail, social media debates flare up over interpretations of body language and text messages. People choose sides in conversations that should have only one, the side of the dead. At the same time, there is something undeniably important about refusing to look away. These events happened in a house that could be anyone's, involving people whose routines look remarkably similar to those of millions of other families. To pretend that such darkness is so rare as to be irrelevant is to lull oneself into a false sense of security. A more honest response involves acknowledging that human beings are capable of extraordinary kindness and extraordinary cruelty, sometimes within the same body, sometimes within the same 24 hours. Inside his prison cell, time moves in a different rhythm. Days are structured by counts, meals, and institutional routines. The world that once demanded so much of him financially and emotionally no longer asks for anything other than compliance. There are no mortgage payments here, no business ventures, no school activities, no travel. The very responsibilities he found so oppressive have vanished, replaced by a rigid system that leaves little room for the illusions of control he once chased. He has, in effect, received exactly what he thought he wanted: freedom from familial obligations, an end to the pressures of domestic life, a severing of ties. Yet the version of that freedom that reality offers is a concrete box, a steel door, a narrow window. There is no new home with his mistress, no spontaneous trips, no reinvention as a carefree bachelor. The future he imagined, built on the destruction of 3 lives, turned out to be a fantasy that could not survive contact with the legal system and with the basic moral standards of the society he betrayed. Observers sometimes ask whether he feels genuine remorse. In his carefully controlled statements, he uses the language of regret. He speaks about wishing he could go back, about not recognizing himself. Yet remorse is not measured solely by words. It is measured by the courage to confront, without self-pity, the full extent of the pain one has caused. Only he knows what passes through his mind in the long nights when the noise of the prison quiets and there is nothing left to distract him from the images of the faces he erased. For those left behind, there is no neat psychological arc, no tidy resolution. Her parents live with the knowledge that the man they once welcomed into their family, the one their daughter had loved and defended, murdered not only her, but also their granddaughters and the grandson they never had the chance to hold. Every memory of him is now contaminated by that fact. They cannot look at old photographs without seeing both the smiling young couple they once believed in and the future reality that lay hidden within that frame. Her friends, scattered across states, carry their own grief. They remember late-night conversations, shared hotel rooms during work trips, whispered confidences about marriage and health. They remember the last messages they exchanged, the ones that now read like foreshadowing in a story that no one realized was racing toward a tragic climax. Some of them replay those exchanges in their minds, wondering if there was a moment when they could have said something that might have changed the course of events. This, too, is a burden of survivors, the illusion of hypothetical control over something that was entirely the killer's responsibility. The house where everything unfolded remains, physically, an ordinary structure. New furniture covers the floors. New laughter may fill the rooms. Fresh coats of paint attempt to seal in the past, but the history attached to those walls cannot be fully renovated away. It exists in property records, in search engine results, in the whispered cautionary tales told to new residents in the area. It exists in the minds of those who watched the story unfold in real time, who remember the sinking feeling when the missing posters became memorials. If there is any kind of meaning to be drawn from this, it is not the kind that redeems or justifies. No grand lesson can balance the scales against the loss of 3 lives and an unborn child. There is, however, a quieter truth that emerges, one that speaks less about him and more about everyone else. It is the truth that vigilance matters, that friends who insist when something feels wrong can become the first line of defense against darkness. The friend who refused to accept his vague explanations on the day of the disappearance played a crucial role in ensuring that the truth came out quickly, that the victims did not remain hidden indefinitely in the anonymous sprawl of industrial land. Her insistence did not save their lives, but it did prevent their killer from enjoying the illusion of success for long. It ensured that their remains were recovered, that their deaths were not lost entirely to secrecy. It allowed a measure of closure, however incomplete. In a world where evil sometimes relies on the apathy or hesitation of bystanders, that willingness to act is not nothing. It is a reminder that while we cannot control what others are capable of, we can control whether we look away when something feels wrong. For those who watch the porch interview now, knowing what followed, there is a natural impulse to condemn not only the man, but also their own earlier blindness. How, people ask, could anyone have believed him? The more useful question is not how they failed to see a killer in that moment, but how we might learn to trust our unease more fully when someone's effect does not match the gravity of their words. If a man speaks of his missing children with a casualness that feels out of tune, that dissonance should be taken seriously. Ultimately, the Watts case endures in public consciousness because it exposes a set of raw nerves that lie close to the surface of modern life. It touches on the pressures of curated perfection, the ways social media can mask dysfunction behind a gloss of positivity. It reveals how financial and emotional strain can be hidden behind smiles and inspirational captions. It shows how the human need to be seen as successful can twist into something grotesque when combined with a lack of empathy and a desperate hunger for a different identity. In the end, though, the story returns to the simplest and most devastating of images: a mother who loved fiercely, who fought through illness and hardship to build a home. 2 daughters whose lives were just beginning. A son who never had a chance to take his first breath. And a man who was supposed to protect them, standing in the doorway between the world and their vulnerability, choosing instead to open that door not to safety, but to annihilation. Nothing can change the fact that he crossed that threshold. Nothing can restore the timelines that should have followed: first days of school, graduations, quiet weekend afternoons, the ordinary, unremarkable moments that make up a life well lived. What remains is memory and the responsibility of those who tell this story to center those who were lost, not the man who took them. So when people return again and again to the footage of that house and that porch and that face, what they are really searching for may not be a secret sign that would have given everything away. They may be searching for reassurance that they can still recognize goodness when they see it, that this case, with its chilling betrayal and its calm killer, is an exception rather than a rule. The uncomfortable answer is that there will always be a small number of people who hide their darkness well, who move through the world undetected until the day they act. But there will also always be those who refuse to accept convenient stories, who insist on answers, who call for help, who notice when something is not right and say so. In the balance between those 2 groups lies the fragile safety of families everywhere. The story of Chris Watts, in all its horror, does not change that balance. It merely brings it into sharp, unforgiving focus, reminding us that love, trust, and vigilance are not abstract concepts, but daily choices that may be all that stands between ordinary life and the kind of darkness that once settled, for a time, over a small tan house in Frederick, Colorado. In the years that followed the sentencing, the case settled into a different phase, quieter but no less consequential. The initial roar of coverage faded into a low, steady hum. It became a reference point, invoked whenever another family disappeared under doubtful circumstances, whenever a husband's public appeals did not quite ring true, whenever a smiling photograph of a young mother and children began to circulate with the word "missing" above it. Investigators in other jurisdictions, faced with their own tangled domestic cases, sometimes thought of Frederick, Colorado, as they walked through eerily tidy homes. They had watched the body camera footage from that August day more than once, had heard the tone of the husband's voice, had seen the way his eyes slid away when questions cut too close. That memory became, in their minds, a kind of calibration. When they encountered similar dissonance between words and effect, it sharpened their instincts. It did not turn every quiet spouse into a suspect, but it ensured that they asked harder questions sooner. For the broader public, the case became an uncomfortable mirror held up to modern domestic life. People scrolled through their social media feeds and saw carefully arranged images of happiness, knowing now, more than ever, that a still frame told only a fraction of any story. Some felt gratitude that their own conflicts, however painful, had not metastasized into something lethal. Others felt a faint, unspoken fear as they wondered what might be simmering behind the curated surfaces they saw each day. The digital traces left by the victims took on a new significance. Her live videos, once sales tools for a health product, became testimonies of a woman's determination to build a life worth living. Her posts about her daughters, about their milestones and illnesses and bedtime routines, turned into a documented archive of motherhood that reached far beyond her original audience. People who had never heard of her before the murders found themselves watching hour after hour of footage, drawn not by morbid curiosity in the crime, but by a need to understand who had been lost. In those recordings, she spoke with the casual intimacy of someone addressing friends. She laughed at her own exhaustion, celebrated minor victories, and described her husband in glowing terms. She called him her rock, her partner, her best friend. Every time she used those words, viewers felt a sharp twist of retrospective sorrow. They knew that, in the end, the person she trusted most would become the source of her destruction. Yet within those same videos, they also saw her resilience, a woman who had refused to let illness define her, who had carved out a place for herself in a difficult world. Her daughters, captured in those clips, were often unscripted. They toddled in and out of frame, interrupting, climbing, demanding attention with the unfiltered urgency of early childhood. They sang songs, mispronounced words, and beamed when their mother turned the camera in their direction. The ease of their movements around both parents suggested a household where, for much of their short lives, they had felt secure. That knowledge makes the ending no less terrible, but it does indicate that their existence was not defined solely by the man who would eventually harm them. They also had days of joy, of warmth, of being cherished, and those days cannot be erased even by what followed. In letters and interviews, some viewers spoke of how watching those videos altered their own relationships. They found themselves hugging their children a little tighter, apologizing more quickly after arguments, paying closer attention to the emotional weather inside their homes. The case had not made them paranoid exactly, but it had jolted them into recognizing the fragility of the structures they sometimes took for granted. They realized that marriages and families do not crumble overnight. They fracture over time, sometimes silently, in ways that can be repaired if addressed, or exploited if left to those inclined toward harm. Meanwhile, in the prison where he now lived, the case that had once saturated news cycles became part of institutional memory. New staff learned about him during briefings, warned of his notoriety, reminded to treat him as they would any other inmate, firmly, professionally, without giving him the gratification of special attention. Among other prisoners, his name initially circulated with a mixture of contempt and curiosity. Child killers occupy a distinct place in the inmate hierarchy, often targeted for violence, yet also sometimes sought out for macabre bragging rights by those who wish to say they have spoken to someone the outside world can never stop discussing. He navigated this environment with the same quiet, unobtrusive demeanor that had characterized much of his life before the murders. He kept his head down, followed rules, participated in required programs. On paper, his conduct was often described as compliant, even model. There is a cruel irony in that description. A man who had utterly failed in the most basic moral obligations now succeeded, to some extent, in adhering to the strict but simple demands of prison life. It underscored a truth that had always been present. His problem had never been an inability to follow rules. It had been an unwillingness to truly see other human beings as ends in themselves rather than as obstacles or adornments. Occasionally, journalists requested access to him, hoping to draw out some new angle, some deeper confession, some insight that might help explain the chasm between the father in the home videos and the man who killed his family. Most of these requests were denied or tightly controlled. When he did speak, his words traveled quickly through the same networks that had once amplified the story of the crime itself. Each statement was weighed against previous ones, scrutinized for inconsistencies, parsed for evidence of self-pity masquerading as remorse. In these accounts, he often cast himself as a man who had been overtaken by something he did not fully recognize. He spoke about darkness, about feeling pushed, about the surreal nature of that night and morning. The language, though superficially repentant, still contained traces of evasion. The closest he came to true moral clarity lay not in any single phrase, but in the rare moments when he acknowledged without condition that no one else was responsible. In those brief admissions, stripped of justifying language, a stark truth emerged: there were other paths, and he had chosen the worst of them. For her family, the passage of time did not soften the edges of loss, but it did change their relationship to public attention. In the early days, they had been thrust into the spotlight, their grief exposed to cameras and comment sections. Every expression, every tremor in the voice was captured, replayed, and sometimes cruelly dissected by strangers who had made the case part of their online lives. As years went by, the family retreated as much as possible into more private spaces. They spoke when they felt it necessary to correct misinformation or to honor anniversaries. Otherwise, they focused on the difficult work of living. The grave markers and memorials for their daughter and granddaughters became physical anchors for their mourning. They visited, left flowers, traced names carved in stone. The unborn grandson's name, given posthumously, was included, ensuring that he too, though he never drew breath in the open air, was recognized as part of the family's story. At these sites, there were no cameras, no online debates, no analysis of body language. There were only people who had loved and been loved, standing in the presence of something that can never be fully put into words. If one listens closely to the way those who knew her speak about her now, a particular theme emerges. They do not remember her primarily as a victim of her husband. They remember her as a fighter, against illness, against financial hardship, against the expectations that others sometimes placed on her. They recall her stubbornness, her willingness to push through discomfort, her determination to build a better life for her children than the one she had known. This does not erase the end she met, but it rescues her identity from being defined solely by the manner of her death. In the realm of true crime media, the story continues to be retold, each production layering on new commentary, new interviews, new emotional framing. Some of these retellings are handled with care, centering the humanity of the victims and acknowledging the ethical weight of transforming real suffering into narrative. Others slip into sensationalism, leaning on ominous music and lurid language, risking the reduction of complex lives into simple entertainment. Viewers, in turn, make their own choices about what they consume and why. The enduring fascination with this case is not solely about the violence itself. It is about the dissonance between appearance and reality, the gap between the smiling family Christmas photos and the truth of what was happening behind closed doors. People are drawn to that gap because it raises unsettling questions about their own perceptions. Who in their circle might be silently unraveling? What secrets might sit just beneath the surface of seemingly stable lives? How many crises have been averted by the simple fact that most people, even at their lowest, cannot bring themselves to cross certain lines? In this sense, the Watts case becomes less an isolated horror and more a stark reminder of the importance of early honesty. Had he admitted his affair, had he accepted the financial and social consequences of divorce, had he voiced his discontent instead of burying it until it mutated, the outcome, while painful, could have been survivable for everyone involved. The path of truth would have led through tears, anger, lawyers, and custody schedules. It would not have led to shallow graves and life sentences. For some viewers, particularly those in long marriages or with grown children, this realization carries a painful kind of clarity. They have lived through phases of resentment, of temptation, of wishing for escape. They understand, in a way younger audiences may not, how easy it can be to nurture private fantasies of a different life. The Watts case does not suggest that such fantasies are, in themselves, monstrous. It suggests instead that when fantasies are combined with emotional immaturity, an absence of empathy, and a willingness to lie without flinching, they can become dangerous. The children at the heart of this story have, in the end, a legacy that their killer can never fully control. Scholarships, charitable foundations, and quiet donations have been made in their names, directed toward causes that reflect what their mother valued: children's welfare, support for families facing medical diagnoses, resources for those trying to rebuild after financial collapse. In this way, the lives that were cut short continue to echo, not only in memory but in tangible acts of kindness extended to others. For those who never knew the family personally, yet nonetheless find themselves thinking of them years later, the case functions as a kind of moral checkpoint. It invites them to examine their own relationships, to speak more honestly about dissatisfaction, to take seriously the mental health of themselves and those around them. It is not that any amount of conversation could have summoned empathy into a heart where so little existed. But greater openness in general, across many households, may, in other contexts, prevent a desperate person from feeling that annihilation is the only way out. And still, beneath all layers of analysis and reflection, the core remains heartbreakingly simple. 4 lives were destroyed because one man decided that his desires mattered more than their right to exist. No amount of context softens that truth. There were influences, pressures, opportunities, and enabling factors, but there was also a choice. He made it, and others must live with the consequences long after his name eventually fades from headlines and indexes. If one were to stand today on the cul-de-sac in Frederick, the scene would look unremarkable. Children might be riding bicycles along the curved curb. Dogs might bark behind fences. A delivery truck might pause, engine idling, while a driver walks a package to a front door. The sky would stretch broad and high above the neatly aligned rooftops, the same sky that watched everything unfold on that August morning without intervening. There would be nothing visible to distinguish one house from another. Nothing to announce that within those walls, at a particular moment in time, a line was crossed that can never be uncrossed. The horror does not linger in the siding or the bricks. It lingers in memory, in consciousness, in the stories people tell each other late at night when talking softly about how little we sometimes know of what others carry inside. And perhaps that is where this story now resides most powerfully, not in court transcripts or documentary frames, but in those private conversations where people who have watched the case unfold turn to each other and say, with a mixture of fear and determination, that they will do whatever they can to ensure that in their own homes, in their own lives, truth is spoken earlier, help is sought sooner, and the precious, fragile trust placed in them by those who share their roof is never treated as an obstacle to be removed, but as the most serious responsibility they will ever hold.